The chipped formica of the desk felt cold under my elbows. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, not just the surface. I was already logging the perimeter check, marking off the north gate as secure when I realized I hadn't actually looked at the north gate. Just the camera feed, just a green check mark on a digital map. I finished the entry, then sighed and leaned back. 3 minutes into my first shift, and I was already phoning it in. It wasn't laziness, exactly, just tired. Every little thing felt like it took effort, even pretending to care about a vacant military base. The base was bigger than I'd expected. Even after the site manager, Vera, gave me the tour yesterday. Mostly just long, low buildings, concrete and corrugated steel. The main complex was a maze of hallways and offices, most of it gutted. They'd stripped out anything valuable, of course. Wiring, copper piping, even the doorknobs. What was left smelled like dust and old metal, overlaid with something vaguely chemical, a lingering disinfectant, maybe, or something used to neutralize whatever they'd been doing here before. It wasn't a bad smell, just persistent. Like it clung to the back of your throat. The air was dry too, made my skin itch. Vera hadn't said much about what this place was exactly, just that it was a former communication hub, something to do with signals intelligence. Now it was being converted into a data storage facility, she said. Secure, she'd emphasized, very secure. Which is why they needed overnight security, which is why I was here, trading sleep for another month of health insurance premiums. Every shift was another small battle against the rising tide of medical bills. Every hour felt like a direct subtraction from the second mortgage. She'd handed me a binder, a thick thing with a faded blue cover labeled Facility Procedures, standard stuff, emergency contacts, fire protocols, access codes. Buried about halfway through, between the section on visitor management and the inventory checklist for first aid kits, I'd found a few extra pages, folded over and tucked in, typed on what looked like ancient dot matrix paper, yellowed and brittle. A list of rules. The first one read, "Do not bring cut flowers, potted plants, or fresh produce into the server rooms. Sealed packaged food is acceptable." Okay, weird. I'd glanced around the server rooms during the tour, and they were just empty concrete shells. No reason to worry about tulips. I moved on. The next, do not stop moving in Corridor 4. If you need to review something, step into a room first. Corridor 4? I hadn't even noticed corridor numbering. Vera hadn't mentioned it. I pictured it, a long, straight hallway probably. The whole place felt like long, straight hallways. I made a mental note to check it out, but figured it was just some peculiar architectural quirk. Maybe a draft? Then came, do not whistle, hum, or sing anywhere on the premises. If you hear anyone doing so, leave the area immediately. That one gave me pause. I always whistle absent-mindedly. It's a habit. Drives Connie crazy, but she says it's endearing. A nervous tick, she calls it. I tried to stop consciously, but it just felt wrong. Like holding my breath, I quickly dismissed it. Probably just a way to discourage loitering or some kind of noise sensitivity thing. Old equipment, maybe? The list went on. If you see a man in a gray suit, do not acknowledge him. Never prop a door open. Don't volunteer for overtime on the last Friday of the month. If you bleed, leave. Don't copy anything. Each one more peculiar than the last. They felt like the kind of thing some bored security guard had written years ago, just to mess with the new guy. A running joke, a local legend. I almost laughed. I finished the perimeter check, then walked the central hub. Just getting my bearings. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows. I passed Corridor 4. It was exactly as I'd imagined. Long, straight, unremarkable. I didn't stop. I didn't feel any need to stop. Back at the desk, I straightened the stack of paperwork, trying to ignore the slight prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It was probably just the dry air, or the coffee. I hadn't had a decent cup all day. I started whistling softly, a little tune Connie liked. It died in my throat. I didn't know why, but it felt wrong. I stopped and the silence felt heavier than it should have. I reached for my coffee, and my hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the desk. A small, silver sugar spoon. I don't take sugar. I was logging the serial numbers from the emergency lighting fixtures. Tedious work. Each one was in a slightly different spot, hidden behind a grill or taped to the back of the unit. Vera hadn't specified why I needed to do it. just that it was a priority. Inventory control, she'd said with that tight smile she used when she didn't want to explain something. It felt like a way to keep me busy, to make it look like I was doing something important while mostly just wandering around a cold, empty building. The air in server room B was particularly stale. It smelled like dust and old metal. Not unpleasant exactly, just empty. It reminded me of my grandfather's workshop, the one he'd always kept locked, full of tools he hadn't touched in years, but still meticulously organized. I traced the number with my pen, double-checking against the printed sheet. 784 Alpha 92. Got it. I'd been at it for almost 2 hours, moving systematically through the server rooms on the West Wing. The monotony was almost soothing. It gave me time to think, to run through the list of things I needed to do when I got home. Pick up Connie's prescription, call the insurance company about the pre-authorization for her new medication, try to find a plumber who wouldn't charge an arm and a leg to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom. Small things, but they all added up. Every little worry was another weight on my chest. That's when Yolanda walked in, carrying a vase, a bright, cheerful arrangement of lilies and daisies. She'd been hired a few weeks back to handle some of the data migration, still wearing a visitor's badge. She was talking to herself, humming a pop song I couldn't quite place. Thought this place could use a little brightening up, she said, setting the vase on the small table near the entrance. It's so gray in here. My throat tightened. I stared at the flowers. Lilies. Bright white. Overpowering scent. I remembered the rule, the one about no plants. It hadn't felt important then, just another oddity in a list of oddities. Now, looking at those flowers, it felt different. A low hum started in my ears, not a sound, but a sensation. Like standing too close to a power line. I tried to dismiss it. It was just a silly rule, probably a leftover from when the place was still actively used by the military. Something about potential allergens, maybe, or a risk of pests. It didn't matter. It was just a flower arrangement, a nice gesture. But the image of the yellowed, brittle paper with the typed instructions flashed in my mind. Do not bring cut flowers, potted plants, or fresh produce into the server rooms. Yolanda was looking at me expectantly. Don't you think they look nice? I stood up, my legs feeling strangely heavy. They're nice, I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. I walked over to the flowers, carefully picked up the vase, and walked back outside. The cool night air hit my face, a welcome relief. Everything okay? Yolanda asked, following me. Fine, I said, placing the vase on the loading dock, tucked between a stack of pallets and a rusted-out dumpster. Just allergies. A pathetic excuse, I knew. I could practically feel her questioning gaze on my back. Oh, that's too bad. I thought they'd cheer the place up. She paused. You're not allergic to lilies, are you? No, I said quickly, too quickly. Just a sensitivity to strong scents. I turned away, pretending to check the lock on the loading dock door. Anything to avoid her questions. Okay, she said, her voice laced with a hint of suspicion. Well, I should get back to work. She went back inside, leaving me standing on the loading dock with the scent of lilies clinging to my hands. I looked back at the base, at the dark, silent windows. I should have said something, explained, but I couldn't. The rule, vague and unsettling as it was, had felt absolute. After finishing the lighting inventory, I checked in with Una on the radio. She was covering the East Wing. She said she'd been meaning to ask me about my wife. Connie had been admitted to the hospital again last week for a flare-up. I'd promised to call her, to give her an update. I hadn't gotten around to it. I'd been too busy with the lights, with the rules, with the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. Now, listening to Una's concerned voice, I realized I'd let another day slip away, another opportunity missed. And with it, a growing certainty that this job wasn't just about keeping the place secure. It was about something else entirely. Something I didn't understand, and something I was increasingly afraid to find out. I was checking the fire extinguishers. It felt important, even though I'd already done it twice. Each one had a little tag dated with the last inspection. All green, all good. Still, I went through them systematically, starting at the west end of the complex and working my way east. It was a way to fill the time, I guess. A way to feel like I was actually doing something. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a dull, constant drone that had burrowed its way into my skull. The extinguishers were mostly in alcoves, little indentations in the concrete walls. Easy enough to reach, easy enough to check. I made a note of the serial numbers in my little book, the pen scratching against the paper. It was quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but it was always quiet, wasn't it? Just me and the ghosts of soldiers who'd probably walked these halls decades ago. I caught myself whistling again, a little fragment of a tune my dad used to like. I stopped it almost immediately. I'd reached Corridor 4. It was a long one, stretching almost the entire width of the building. Server rooms lined one side, offices the other. The air in here always felt colder, even though the thermostat was set the same as everywhere else. I could see the far end, the emergency exit door, a pale rectangle in the dimness. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my wife, Connie. Just checking in, asking if I'd remembered to pick up her medication after my shift. I stopped walking for a second. To read the text, to type a quick reply. Yes, honey. Got it covered. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. And that's when the lights started to go out. Not all at once. It wasn't a dramatic flick-off, more a gradual dimming. Starting at the far end of the corridor, near the emergency exit. One by one, the fluorescent tubes lost their fight, sputtering and fading until they were dark. It wasn't a power outage, not exactly. The lights closer to me stayed stubbornly illuminated, casting long, distorted shadows. It was as if something was consuming the light, working its way down the corridor. I told myself it was just a faulty circuit. Old wiring. This place was falling apart, after all. It didn't mean anything, just a coincidence. A bit unsettling, sure, but nothing to worry about. The base was always having electrical issues. I'd reported a flickering bulb in the cafeteria last week, but even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't just that. It felt intentional, like something was making them go out. I started walking again, quickly, almost instinctively. I didn't even think about it, just moved. I kept my eyes fixed on the end of the corridor, on the darkness that was steadily creeping closer. It felt like if I stopped, something would happen. I didn't know what, but the feeling was sharp and undeniable. I remembered something then, a fragment of a rule. Something about not stopping in this corridor, about needing to keep moving, about stepping into a room if you needed to do something instead of pausing in the open space. I couldn't recall the exact wording. It was all fuzzy, like a half-remembered dream. But the impression was clear. This corridor didn't like to be interrupted. I didn't slow down, didn't look back, just kept walking, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. I passed the last server room, the blinking lights of the servers casting an eerie glow, and then I was out of the corridor, turning the corner into the main lobby. The lights in Corridor 4 were all gone now, pitch black. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a power surge, a coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something bad. I glanced back down the corridor. Nothing, just darkness. But I knew with a chilling certainty that if I'd stopped, if I'd hesitated, if I'd tried to figure out what was happening, something would have been waiting for me at the end of that hall. Something I didn't want to see. I made a note in my book, not about the fire extinguishers, just one word, corridor, and then underlined a single question mark. I checked the time, still hours left on my shift, and now a new unwelcome companion, a persistent chill that had settled deep in my bones. I was checking the emergency exits. All 12 of them, each one needed a visual inspection, making sure the crash bars weren't obstructed, the red exit signs were illuminated, and the doors swung freely. It was tedious work, the kind of thing that felt important but also utterly pointless, like polishing the brass on the Titanic. Still, it was something to do, something to occupy my mind. The base was quiet as usual. Just the hum of the generators and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was a dry cold tonight, the kind that sucked the moisture right out of your skin. I could feel it in my nostrils, a papery dryness with each breath. I'd forgotten to put on lip balm this morning. probably cracked and bleeding by now. I finished exit 8, a heavy steel door leading out to what used to be a parade ground. Now it was just a weed-choked field, slowly being reclaimed by nature. I started walking towards exit 9, which was further down the east wing. It was a long walk, and my feet were starting to ache. I needed new insoles, and maybe a new job. That's when I realized I was whistling. A little tune. Something old. Something my dad used to sing. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. It just happened. A quiet, almost subconscious melody. I stopped abruptly. My cheeks felt warm. I hadn't whistled in years. Not since before everything with my wife Vera. She used to love it when I whistled. Said it always cheered her up. I hadn't even thought about it until this moment. It felt strange, almost unnatural, like a muscle memory I'd forgotten I had. It was probably nothing, just stress. A way to release some of the tension I'd been carrying around. I was a nervous whistler, apparently. I'd never known. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was just a habit, a harmless quirk. But then I remembered something. A vague impression, something from the manual. About noise, about not making any unnecessary sounds. Something about a prohibition. I couldn't recall the exact wording. It wasn't as clear as the rule about the flowers or the corridor. It was more of a feeling, a warning, a sense of wrongness. I remembered reading something about whistling specifically. Or perhaps it was humming or singing. The details were hazy. But the core message was clear. Silence. This place didn't want to be filled with sound. It felt absurd, of course. Like a rule written by someone who was overly sensitive to noise. But then again, so much about this place felt absurd. I glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed. The corridor stretched out before me, empty and silent. I told myself I was being ridiculous, overreacting. It was just a whistle, a tiny, insignificant sound. No one was around to hear it, no harm done. It was silly to let it bother me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd broken a rule that mattered. And the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I became. The air felt thick, heavy. My ears started to ring. I started walking quickly towards exit 9. I didn't look back. I didn't whistle again. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I reached exit 9 and ran through the checklist. Crash bar, clear, sign, illuminated, door, swings freely. I didn't linger. I didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. I needed to get away. As I turned to leave, I noticed something. A faint vibration, a humming sensation in the floor beneath my feet. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it seemed to be getting stronger. I froze, listening. The humming grew louder, resonating through the concrete. It wasn't coming from the generators. It wasn't coming from the electrical system. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the very structure of the building itself. I took a step back, and then another. The humming intensified, building to a low, throbbing drone. It felt like the building was responding to something to me. I pulled out my radio. Base, this is Kieran. Do you copy? Static. I tried again. Base, do you copy? More static. I switched channels. Still nothing. The radio was dead. I turned and walked quickly, not ran, back down the corridor, away from exit 9, away from the humming, away from whatever was happening. I didn't whistle, not even a little. I'm going to check the security cameras, see if anything unusual has been recorded. I've got this feeling that I need to know what's going on. I feel like I need to understand. But I have a terrible feeling that understanding won't make things any better, and I have a new habit now, checking my mouth every few minutes to make sure it's closed. I was logging the temperature readings from the generator room. It was a pointless task, really. The system was fully automated. Redundant cooling systems, everything monitored remotely, but it was in the contract. Regular physical verification of critical systems, that's what it said. So I walked the perimeter, clipboard in hand, noting the digital readout matched the analog gauge. 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 degrees. Over and over. The generator room smelled like ozone and warm metal, a smell I was starting to find comforting. It was predictable, unlike everything else in this place. The base had been a radar installation, apparently. Built into the side of the hill, all concrete and thick steel doors. They were converting it into some kind of private data storage facility, but the work was stalled. Funding issues I gathered from the snippets of conversation I'd overheard from Vera while she was doing her rounds. She was the site manager, a no-nonsense woman with a permanent frown. I hadn't seen her since my shift started. I finished the generator room, signed off on the log, and started towards the server farm, Sector D. It was a long walk, down a series of connecting corridors. The fluorescent lights hummed, the sound bouncing off the bare concrete walls. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. Quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I found myself automatically slowing my pace, scanning the corners. Habit, I guess. The job was making me jumpy. I passed the break room. The faint smell of stale coffee hung in the air. I could see Connie's lunch bag still sitting on the table. She'd been on the early shift. I kept walking. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the doorway of Sector D, just inside the entrance. An older man, maybe in his 60s, wearing a suit, a dark gray suit. He wasn't one of the construction crew. I hadn't seen him before. He wasn't carrying a hard hat or a toolbox. He just stood there, perfectly still, looking at the floor. I almost said something. "Can I help you, sir?" It was already forming in my throat, but then something stopped me. Not a sound, not a feeling, just a hesitation. A flicker of something wrong in the back of my mind. He didn't look like he belonged, but I couldn't place why. Maybe he was an inspector, someone from corporate. I hadn't been briefed on any visits. And then I remembered, with a jolt, something about not interfering with personnel, something about letting the team handle things. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but it felt important. A directive. It was probably in the orientation paperwork. I'd skimmed through so much of it. Terms and conditions, liability waivers, emergency protocols, it all blurred together. I'd been too focused on the medical bills to really pay attention. He hadn't moved, still looking at the floor. I started to walk faster, deliberately avoiding eye contact. I told myself I was being respectful, giving the man space. It was probably embarrassing to be interrupted. I focused on the door to Sector D, on the need to get the temperature log done and move on. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I passed him, close enough to smell something faint, almost floral, clinging to the fabric of his suit. It didn't belong in this place. It didn't belong with him. I kept my gaze fixed on the door, forcing myself to breathe normally. I could feel his presence behind me, a weight in the air. I reached the keypad, entered my code, and the door to Sector D clicked open. I stepped inside, and the temperature hit me, a consistent, frigid 62 degrees. I started the logging process, trying to ignore the lingering scent, the nagging feeling that I'd done something wrong, that I should have said something. I hadn't seen him for a second, but I glanced back as I was completing the log. He was gone. Vanished. Just like that. I told myself he'd simply walked off. Maybe he wasn't supposed to be there, and he'd realized his mistake and quietly left. It was the most logical explanation. A simple misunderstanding. I finished the log, initialed it, and tucked it into my clipboard. I checked the corridor again, just in case, but there was no sign of him. I started back towards the security office, my pace brisker now. I needed a coffee, and maybe, just maybe, I needed to reread that orientation paperwork. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the corridor remained empty, except for the humming of the lights, and the scent, a ghost of something floral, that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. I had a sudden, irrational urge to open a window, even though there weren't any. And I noticed, as I walked, that I hadn't whistled once since I'd passed that man. Not even a little. I'm not sure why. I was restocking the first aid kits. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a reliable part of the rotation. Each kit had a checklist taped to the inside of the lid. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, burn cream, gauze, gloves, the little emergency blankets that crinkled like foil. I went methodically, comparing the contents against the list, replacing anything that was used or expired. Sector A, then B, then C. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones after a few hours. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the building settling. Sector C was mostly storage rooms, old offices that hadn't been fully cleared out. Boxes of outdated files, broken furniture draped with plastic sheeting, that sort of thing. The kits here were in the supply closet, a cramped space crammed with cleaning supplies and spare light bulbs. I had both arms full, a box of antiseptic wipes in one, a stack of gauze pads in the other when I reached the door. It was slightly ajar. Not enough to walk through, but enough to require a nudge with my foot to fully open it. I hesitated for a split second. It felt wrong. Not scary exactly, just off. I glanced around. Empty. The corridor stretched out before me, bathed in the pale fluorescent light. No one in sight. I shifted the boxes, trying to get a better grip, and used the heel of my boot to push the door wider. It swung open silently, revealing the cramped supply closet. I told myself it was just the wind, even though there weren't any windows open, even though the ventilation system was designed to maintain a constant pressure. It was an old building, prone to drafts. That was all. I stepped inside, setting the boxes down on a shelf. The scent of pine sol hung heavy in the air. I started organizing the kits, replacing the used items, making sure everything was neatly arranged. I could still feel the slight pressure on my foot from propping the door open. It was a silly thing to do, really. Inconvenient. I'd have to make another trip to carry everything in. Then something flickered at the edge of my vision. A movement in the doorway. I straightened up, my grip tightening on a roll of gauze. It was just a shadow, I told myself. A trick of the light. The fluorescent bulbs were known to flicker. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. But it wasn't a flicker. Standing in the doorway, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure. Tall and slender. Almost impossibly so. It wasn't the man in the suit. This was different. The shape was wrong. The proportions were off. It looked like a person, but stretched and distorted, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't looking at me, not directly. Its gaze seemed to be fixed on something beyond me. Something in the far corner of the closet. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, perfectly still, a silent, unsettling presence. I remembered something then, a fragment of the orientation paperwork. Something about doors. Never leave a door open. Something about thresholds, a boundary. I couldn't recall the exact wording. The text had been dense, full of legal jargon, but the gist of it was clear. A propped door was bad. I hadn't even thought about it when I used my foot. It had been automatic, a momentary lapse in attention. Just a convenience. Now, looking at that distorted figure in the doorway, I understood. I reached out and gently pulled the door closed. The click of the latch echoed in the silence. The figure was gone. Vanished. As if it had never been there. I stood there for a long moment, my heart doing something irregular against my ribs, not pounding but fluttering, like a trapped bird. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a hollow, sickening feeling of wrongness. I told myself it was exhaustion. I hadn't been sleeping well, worrying about my wife. The stress was getting to me. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dim light. I finished restocking the kits, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I grabbed the remaining supplies, carefully closing the closet door behind me. This time I used my hand. I made 2 trips. It was slower, more tedious, but I couldn't risk it. Not again. As I walked back towards the security office, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The corridor was empty, but the feeling lingered. The sense of being watched. And a new sensation, a subtle prickling on the back of my neck. I hadn't whistled once since I'd seen that thing, and I didn't think I could even if I tried. The sound felt wrong, like it would break something. I checked my watch, another 3 hours until dawn. I needed more coffee, and I needed to scrub this feeling off my skin. I kept replaying the image in my mind, that distorted figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't a hallucination. I knew it wasn't. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that had been allowed to enter because of a carelessly propped door. And I had a terrible feeling that it wasn't finished. I was inventorying the first aid kits in the West Wing. Mostly restocking bandages and antiseptic wipes. Tedious work. But it gave me something to do. Something to focus on that wasn't the bills piling up on the kitchen counter or the way my wife, Clara, flinched when she tried to button her coat. It was cold now, even inside. The base always felt colder this time of year, like the concrete itself was absorbing the November chill. I checked the expiration dates on everything, making a mental note of what needed replacing. Trudy in dispatch was supposed to order supplies, but she was unreliable. Best to be prepared. The kits were all the same dull gray plastic, stacked neatly on shelves in a small storage room. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust, a sterile institutional odor. I liked it actually. It felt orderly. I preferred orderly. My life hadn't been very orderly lately. I finished the last kit, carefully arranging the gauze pads and tape inside. I whistled softly, almost without realizing it, a little tune Clara used to hum when she was gardening. I stopped myself almost immediately. That felt wrong, still. I was about to head back to the office when my phone buzzed. A text from Clara. "How's it going? Any weirdness?" She knew I didn't like this job, knew I was already on edge. I typed back a quick, slow, quiet, all good, which wasn't entirely a lie. It was quiet and slow, but good felt like a stretch. I shoved the phone back in my pocket. A notice had gone up on the bulletin board earlier that week, a request for someone to cover a double shift on the 15th. Someone had called out sick, $15 an hour overtime. It was a lot of money. A lot. Enough to cover at least a portion of Clara's latest medication. I hadn't volunteered. I usually avoided overtime, but I'd been thinking about it all night. I walked past the small window in the storage room and glanced at my watch. 11:47 p.m. The shift officially ended at midnight. Another 15 minutes, and I could start thinking about getting home. Then I saw the sign-up sheet again, taped to the break room door. It was almost empty. Just one name on it, Felix. And below that, in smaller handwriting, a note, "Confirm date, see dispatch." I remembered something then, something vague from the orientation packet, a warning. Something about certain dates being problematic. Not specifically forbidden, but discouraged. Dates to avoid if possible. I couldn't recall the details, just a general sense of unease. I dismissed it at the time as bureaucratic overcaution. I walked over to dispatch and found Trudy half asleep at her console. "Hey, Trudy," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Anything about that overtime shift on the 15th? I think I saw a note." Trudy blinked slowly, like an owl. "Oh yeah, they changed it. It's tonight. Starts at midnight. It's a long one, though, until 8 a.m. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. The 15th tonight. I remembered a phrase now, fragmented and hazy, something about cycles, and avoiding extended shifts. "They didn't mention it was tonight when they put the sign-up sheet out," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Trudy shrugged. "Things change. Happens all the time. Extra money is extra money, right?" I glanced at the clock again. 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes until my shift ended. 7 minutes until I could go home. And now, 7 minutes until I had to decide whether to take on a shift that suddenly felt wrong. The money was tempting. Desperately tempting. Clara needed that medication. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't a rational fear. It was something deeper, something primal. It was like a cold hand pressing against the back of my skull. I rationalized. It was just a shift. A long shift, sure, but just a shift. Trudy was right. Extra money was extra money. And I was being silly, letting an old, half-remembered warning get to me. It was probably just a way for management to discourage people from burning out. I could handle a long shift. I'd worked longer shifts before. I needed the money. I told Trudy I'd take it. The moment the words left my mouth, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The fluorescent lights flickered, then settled back into their usual sickly hum. But something had shifted. It wasn't anything I could see or hear exactly. It was a change in the texture of the silence, a pressure in my chest. I looked around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain the feeling. Nothing. I checked the security cameras, scrolling through the feeds. Everything appeared normal, empty corridors, darkened offices. But then, in the camera covering Corridor 6, I saw it. A distortion. A momentary blurring of the image like a heat haze. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Enough to make me realize that whatever that warning had been about, it was real. The clock ticked over to midnight. My official shift had ended, and another had begun. I couldn't reach Clara. I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. She usually left it on while she slept, just in case. That wasn't like her. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I needed to get home to check on her. But I'd committed to the overtime, and I remembered with a chilling certainty that the warning hadn't just discouraged long shifts on those nights. It had warned against leaving during them. I was cataloging the emergency flares in Sector C. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something to do. Each flare was individually sealed in a plastic tube, dated and inspected annually. Most were well within their expiration date, thankfully. Replacing those things couldn't have been cheap. The room smelled of dust and old plastic, a peculiar stale sweetness. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. I ran my hand along the metal shelving, feeling the slight grit under my fingertips. I'd always been a bit of a neat freak, even as a kid. Clara used to tease me about it, said I'd spend half my life dusting. The flares were arranged in rows, numbered sequentially. I had a clipboard and a checklist, ticking off each one as I verified the date. It was mind-numbing work, the kind of work that let your thoughts drift. I found myself thinking about the garden, about how Clara had been talking about planting lilies this spring. She loved lilies. A strange thought given what happened with Yolanda and those flowers in the server room. I quickly pushed it aside. Just a coincidence. A weird one maybe, but a coincidence nonetheless. The base had this way of amplifying small things. A dripping faucet sounded like a waterfall. A creaking floorboard felt like someone walking behind you. It was probably just the building settling, I told myself. Old buildings did that. Still, I found myself whistling, a low, almost subconscious tune, just to fill the silence. I stopped myself almost immediately. That felt wrong. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. It was a habit, ingrained from years of working alone in the garage, tinkering with old cars. Clara always said it soothed her. Now it felt like a violation of some unspoken agreement. Around 4:47 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. Dispatch. Kieran, we have a delivery scheduled for the North Gate. Medical supplies. Estimated time of arrival is 5 minutes. A Dr. Albright is dropping them off. Medical supplies. That was good. Maybe Clara's medication was delayed. Maybe this was it. I made a mental note to check the manifest later. See if anything was marked urgent. I finished up the last row of flares, double-checking the dates, then headed towards the North Gate. The walk took about 10 minutes. The corridors were eerily quiet. I passed the server room and deliberately didn't look inside. The image of Yolanda with those flowers kept flickering at the edge of my vision. Just ignore it. The North Gate was a large, reinforced steel structure, usually unmanned during the night. There was a small intercom and a security camera. I waited outside, the cold seeping through my jacket. The air smelled different here, sharper, almost metallic. I couldn't place it. The minutes ticked by. 2 minutes late, then 5, then 10. Dispatch hadn't said anything. No updates, just silence. Then I remembered a fragment of something I'd read during the initial security briefing. A policy regarding deliveries, something about no-shows. If someone was scheduled to arrive and didn't, there was a specific protocol. Log it, and don't follow up. Don't try to contact them. Just record the missed appointment and move on. It seemed absurd, cold even, but the wording had been very specific. Do not call to follow up. It felt important. I told myself it was just bureaucratic nonsense, a way to avoid liability. Maybe the doctor had gotten stuck in traffic, maybe there was an emergency, but the memory of the man in the suit, the way I'd deliberately avoided eye contact, lingered, and the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I rationalized. It was a precaution, a ridiculous, overblown precaution, but a precaution nonetheless. The base was huge. People got delayed. It happened all the time. I was overreacting. I logged the missed delivery in the system, noting the time and the doctor's name. Dr. Albright. I made sure to enter everything correctly, carefully. The system confirmed the entry. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen. That was it. Done. I resisted the urge to check for incoming messages, to see if dispatch had said anything. I didn't check the security camera feed again, though I wanted to. The rule was clear. Don't follow up. I turned and walked back towards Sector C, the cold air now feeling heavier, more oppressive. The base felt different now, not just quiet but empty, hollow. I passed Corridor 6, the one with the distorted camera feed earlier. I didn't look at the monitor, didn't want to. I quickened my pace, my boots echoing in the silence. The smell of dust and old plastic in Sector C didn't seem comforting anymore. It felt suffocating. I returned to the flares, to the numbered rows, to the mindless task of ticking off boxes, but the checklist blurred before my eyes. I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing towards the intercom, waiting for a message that wouldn't come, waiting for something, anything, but there was nothing, just the silence. And the unsettling certainty that whatever was supposed to arrive at the North Gate hadn't just been delayed. It hadn't arrived at all, and I had just been instructed to pretend it never would. I was inventorying the emergency rations in Sector 4, canned peaches mostly, some crackers, a few boxes of powdered milk that looked like they'd been sitting there since the base was active. It was methodical, boring work, but it gave me something to focus on, something other than the silence. The fluorescent lights hummed, a low, constant drone that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. I'd been trying to remember if Clara liked peaches. She usually preferred pears, but sometimes, when they were really ripe, she'd make a peach cobbler. She hadn't baked in months. I was stacking the peaches, arranging them neatly in the metal shelving unit when it happened. I reached for a case, the cardboard a little damp, and my finger slipped. A small tear opened on the side, and a jagged edge caught the pad of my index finger. It wasn't deep, barely broke the skin, but enough to draw a bead of blood, a bright, startling red against the pale plastic of the shelving. I instinctively pulled my hand back, staring at the cut. It wasn't bad, not at all. I'd gotten worse paper cuts, still, it stung. I reached for a tissue, then paused. Something flickered in my memory. A document, buried somewhere in the initial training materials. Something about injuries, about blood. A rule. I couldn't quite grasp it. The specifics were hazy. Something about cleaning it immediately, and then leaving. Leaving for the rest of the shift, it seemed excessive, ludicrous. Even a paper cut? Seriously? I'd used bigger bandages on splinters. It was probably just a standard first aid precaution, overly cautious. The military was known for that. Overkill for everything. I dismissed it, just a scratch. I grabbed a tissue and pressed it against the cut. It was still bleeding, slowly, stubbornly. I cleaned it with the tissue, then wiped my finger on my jeans. Good enough. I went back to stacking the peaches. I tried to focus on the labels, on the expiration dates, on anything but the throbbing in my finger. But the memory of the rule wouldn't go away. That nagging feeling that I'd overlooked something important. I glanced at my watch. It was 3:17 a.m. 4 hours and 43 minutes left. 4 hours and 43 minutes of wandering these empty corridors. 4 hours and 43 minutes of making sure nothing happened. 4 hours and 43 minutes of pretending everything was normal. The rule was coming back into focus sharper this time, not just cleaning it with the kit provided. There was a first aid kit in the security office, a small metal box with antiseptic wipes and bandages, and the leaving part, leaving for the rest of the shift. No exceptions. It wasn't about the severity of the injury, it was about the injury itself, about the blood. I looked at my finger again. It had stopped bleeding, but a faint smear of red remained, stubbornly clinging to the skin. I remembered the man in the suit, the way I'd avoided his gaze, the feeling of being watched, and the unsettling silence, the way it seemed to press in on me from all sides. I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my stomach, that it wasn't about the cut, it was about the rule. Ignoring it wasn't an option, not after everything else. After Yolanda and the flowers, after the distorted camera feed, after Dr. Albright not showing up, after the way dispatch had gone silent, This was just another thing, another layer. I sighed, a weary, defeated sound that echoed in the empty sector. I carefully placed the case of peaches back on the floor. I turned and walked out of Sector 4, heading back towards the security office. The metal floor felt cold under my boots. I found the first aid kit, opened it, and cleaned the cut properly, using an antiseptic wipe that stung even more than the initial tear. I applied a bandage, a small white square of fabric. Then I logged out of the inventory system. I walked to my desk and logged a note, minor injury, following protocol. Shift termination requested. I didn't bother waiting for a response. I knew there wouldn't be one. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and my phone. As I walked towards the main entrance, I glanced back at Sector 4. The rows of canned peaches stood silent and still, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light. They looked wrong, out of place, like they were waiting for something. I didn't linger. I kept walking. I had 4 hours and 43 minutes left on the clock, and I was leaving, even though I had no idea why, even though it felt like walking away from something important, even though I was absolutely certain that if I stayed, something terrible would happen. I didn't know what. But I knew, and I was leaving it behind. I had to. I was doing inventory in the old motor pool. Not the worst place, honestly. High ceilings, concrete floor, smelled mostly of dust and dried oil. Better than the server room, with its constant hum and the lingering something from Yolanda's flowers. I was scanning the barcodes on crates of what looked like obsolete radio equipment. Mostly just taking stock, confirming what the manifest said was here. It was tedious. The scanner beeped incessantly, but it was quiet. I could lose myself in it, and that was worth something. I'd brought a thermos of coffee, black, and I was working my way through it. The coffee was lukewarm now, but still drinkable. My back was starting to ache. The folding chair they provided was a joke. I shifted my weight, trying to find a comfortable position. I hadn't seen another soul for 2 hours, just the way I liked it. There was a bulletin board near the entrance to the motor pool, covered in those laminated safety notices and procedure reminders, the kind of thing no one ever actually read. But the rules were there, printed in a small, blocky font. I remembered the one about the overtime date, the 15th. I'd volunteered for it, thinking it was just a few extra dollars that now felt tainted. The way the security camera had glitched out when I signed the form. And then my wife being unreachable. It was all connected. I knew it, though how. I couldn't say. It was just a bad feeling, a tightening in my chest. I paused, looking at the rule sheet again. I wanted to refresh my memory. I couldn't quite recall the exact wording of everything. It wasn't that I doubted the rules themselves. It was just that everything felt so chaotic, like trying to hold water in my hands. I reached for my phone, intending to snap a picture. Just a quick reference, something to look at later, when I was back home and could think straight. My finger hovered over the camera icon. The screen was bright, almost jarring in the dim light of the motor pool. The laminated sheet was partially obscured by glare. I adjusted the angle, trying to get a clear shot of the text. That's when I heard it. A high-pitched whine, barely audible, like a dog whistle. It wasn't constant, more like a brief, intermittent pulse. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I lowered my phone, frowning. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It stopped abruptly. I told myself it was the building settling. Old infrastructure, metal groaning. It had to be. This place had been a military base for decades. It was bound to make noises. I was probably just tired, my ears playing tricks on me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced around the motor pool, my eyes scanning the rows of crates and equipment. Everything looked normal, except it didn't. The shadows seemed deeper, more defined. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of light seemed faster. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Again. I tried to dismiss it. I was letting my imagination run wild. I'd been working overnight shifts for a week now. Sleep deprivation was getting to me. Still, I found myself taking a step back, away from the bulletin board. I told myself it was ridiculous. I was being paranoid. I was a grown man, a husband, a provider. I wasn't afraid of creaky buildings and intermittent noises, but the wine, it had felt wrong. I looked back at the rule sheet, and then I remembered, or thought I remembered, something about not making copies, something about information belonging to the premises. It wasn't a clear memory, more of a vague impression. The wording was fuzzy, but the gist of it was there. Don't take anything with you. Don't replicate it. It felt important. The thought of photographing the rules suddenly seemed foolish. Reckless, even. I hadn't considered it before. Not really. It had just seemed like a harmless way to jog my memory. But now it felt like a deliberate provocation, like I was testing something. I lowered my phone completely. I turned off the camera app. I shoved my phone into my pocket. I hadn't taken the picture. Not even close. I hadn't even gotten the entire sheet in the frame. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to calm my racing pulse. The wine hadn't returned. The prickling sensation on my neck had subsided. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. I walked over to my thermos and took a long sip of lukewarm coffee. It tasted bitter, metallic. I grimaced. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the grit of dust between my fingers. I was tired, and I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. I continued the inventory, scanning the barcodes with a renewed sense of purpose, but the image of the rule sheet and the almost taken photograph lingered in my mind. I knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in my gut, that I had come close to making a mistake that could have had consequences. I finished the inventory, meticulously checking each item against the manifest. When I was done, I logged the results into the system. Then I double-checked everything, just to be sure. I didn't want to give anyone a reason to question my work, especially not now. Before leaving the motor pool, I took one last look at the bulletin board. The laminated safety notices and procedure reminders seemed to stare back at me, inscrutable and ominous. I shivered, despite myself. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the corridor. I didn't whistle. Not this time. The chipped formica of the reception desk felt cold under my palms as I signed out. Trudy, the day shift supervisor, barely glanced up. She took the logbook, initialed the line, and said, "See you next week, Kieran. No questions. No, how was it? No pretense of concern. Just a transaction." I walked out into the gray morning. The air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. It wasn't raining, but everything looked damp. The sky was the same color as the buildings, a flat, featureless expanse. I unlocked the car. The click of the remote sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. Driving home, I tried to think about Una, about the doctor's appointment next Tuesday, about anything normal. I kept replaying the last few hours in my head, trying to make it fit. It had been a slow night, unnervingly so, just off, like a radio tuned slightly between stations, a constant static underneath everything. Maybe it was the stress, maybe it was lack of sleep, maybe I was just imagining things. The base was old, decaying. Old buildings did that to you, played tricks with your head. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The house was quiet, too quiet. I hadn't heard from my wife, which wasn't unusual. She often turned her phone off when she was resting. I got out of the car and walked towards the front door, noticing the overgrown rose bushes flanking the entrance. I should prune them. I hadn't had the energy lately. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and disinfectant, a smell that had become synonymous with my wife's illness. I found her in the living room, asleep in her recliner, a stack of books on the side table. She looked smaller than I remembered, her face pale and drawn. I went over and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She didn't stir. I made coffee, careful not to clatter the mugs. I started to unpack my bag, automatically separating my work clothes from everything else. I folded the security uniform, noticing a small dark stain on the sleeve. I couldn't remember getting it dirty. Probably just grease. Probably. As I was folding the clothes, I found myself smoothing out every crease, meticulously aligning the seams. It was compulsive. I hadn't always been like this. I'd never been particularly neat. Now I couldn't seem to stop. Each fold had to be perfect, each edge precisely aligned. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about control, containing something. I realized I hadn't whistled since leaving the base. Not once. Usually I whistle without even realizing it. A habit I've had since I was a kid. It's automatic, a way of filling the silence. But it hadn't come. I tried just a small, tuneless hum, but it caught in my throat. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pressure that wouldn't let it out. My wife stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled weakly. "You're home," she said, her voice raspy. "Just got in," I replied, forcing a smile. I wanted to tell her about the night, about the strange feeling, about the way the security cameras flickered. But I didn't. What was the point? She had enough to worry about. I sat beside her, taking her hand. Her skin was cool and dry. I sat there for a long time, just holding her hand, smoothing it with my thumb, making sure every wrinkle was flattened, every crease was gone. Later, after I'd made her tea and helped her back to bed, I found myself straightening the picture frames in the hallway. Each one had to be perfectly aligned, perfectly level. I checked them again and again, adjusting them by fractions of an inch. It was absurd, I knew, completely irrational, but I couldn't stop. The job posting was still online, I noticed when I checked. Overnight security contractor needed, decommissioned military base, starting immediately. The description was identical to the one I'd answered weeks ago, and beneath it, a new posting. Same base, same requirements. Someone else would be there soon.